You're too kind. It is indeed humbling to be here. Dr. Hashmi, Dr. Shams-ur-Rehman, and of course, my friend, Professor Hassan John. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And meeting with several of the faculty beforehand, I just want to say that I am intimidated by, mashallah, the breadth of expertise and the breadth of disciplines within this program. And I sincerely hope, if you so wish, after my presentation, that we continue a relationship, because I feel I have a lot to learn from every single person in this room. As we all know, this endeavor is not an endeavor that can be... भाईजान आपके पास प्लग होगा? बैटरी लो है? हाँ. चार्जर कनेक्टेड है, बस वो देखें. अच्छा. As we all know, this is an endeavor that cannot be done by a single person. These are things that we have to collaborate on, because each of us have certain areas of expertise and we rely on each other. Again, the overall, I think, adab that I have seen here, the way people have presented themselves it's something that gives me a lot of faith in the future of this country and this region. So I'll be talking about this book, Hidden Caliphate, Batini Khilafat, which came out just this year. And it's a story that takes us across Asia, from Afghanistan to Siberia, to the borders of China, which is based on about a decade and a half of my work in various countries in Central Asia and, of course, all across Pakistan and beloved Pakistan and Afghanistan. I'm going to start by introducing the geography. Would you mind if I stand up? You know, as professors, we like hearing ourselves speak and we like to stand up. So, if you don't mind. So, I'll start with the geography. What are the areas that we're looking at here? And then I'm going to talk about the subjects of my books, the Mujaddidi Sufis, who I think all of us, to a certain degree, have engaged, whether it's through Shah Waliullah Dahlawi or Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi or other great figures who are amongst the pivotal ulama of this part of the world. Then I'm going to talk about the key intervention this book makes. What am I arguing for? Then a bit about the structure, and a brief look at the protagonist, the chief character of this book, in two great cities, Peshawar and Bukhara, which will bring to surface the existence of an intellectual and spiritual network that held together the social fabric of Asia, a network that is either not known or not spoken about, and certainly obliterated from the colonial and the modern nation-state, secular nation-state narratives. I would argue perhaps deliberately. So I'm going to take a moment to place us in the world we're about to enter, and I was hoping to actually get to the map, but since I think all of us are, mashallah, such phenomenal scholars, you will know this part of the world very well. So we've got the two rivers, right? We've got Sindhu, Indus, and then we've got the Amu Darya, which now separates what we call Central Asia from Afghanistan. This story is set against the backdrop of some dramatic changes that are happening in this part of the world. In Central Asia, Afghanistan, what we call South Asia. Of course, I'm going to tell you that all of these terms are nonsensical. They have been thrust upon us. Three great empires, the Mughals, the Safavids, the Janid Uzbeks, are breaking apart, and out of this chaos, this brilliant, ruthless, and a little bit problematic Irani soldier of fortune emerges, named, of course, Nadir Shah Afshar, and he carves out this vast empire which goes all the way from the Caucasus to, of course, North India. We all know this story. Everyone's with me on the story. Then what does he do? In 1747, he dies. And he leaves behind him a vacuum. So this entire area is left bereft of any central authority. So bit by bit, a slew of little states start growing up. in places like Shiraz in Iran, the Zand dynasty, Khiva, Kokand, which is now Farghana, Bukhara in Uzbekistan, Sindh, Kalhoros, and later the Talpurs, Balochistan, the Khans of Kalat reach a new level, and Bahawalpur, so on and so forth. The most important of these states is, please, if I can ask my friends here, what is the most important state that emerges after Nadir Shah?
The Sikh
Sikh is a very important one. I'm sorry, I should say maybe one of the two. Duranis. Duranis, right? So at its height in 1760, it's going from Panipat to Iran, right, from Khorasan. And it's an empire that lasts only about 3 or 4 generations, but has an impact on revitalizing the Muslim world in ways that many of us cannot imagine. This dynamic period also witnessed the proliferation of an intricate network of dargahs, of madrasas, of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufi silsila. I'm going to call it Mujaddidi for short. Now, this silsila had originated some generations earlier with this great scholar, Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, who passed away in 1624. He's known as the reviver, the Mujaddid al-Thasani of the second millennium of Islam. Hence, his followers are, of course, called the Mujaddidis. Among his intellectual contributions, and there are many, and he's a gravely misunderstood figure in this day and age, mostly because most people don't understand theology or fiqh or even the concept of Sharia, and certainly not Sufism. What he does is he reconciles the Sufi path and Sharia into a cohesive system, that one cannot exist without the other, right? And it makes perfect sense. If you have a scholar of Sharia, basically a lawyer in Islamic law, and his insides are rotten, obviously any proclamation that person will make will reflect that. And we know this, the ulama su, right? The very concept of that, right? It's like any sort of money-grubbing lawyer that we have today in various parts of the world. And the same way, if you've got someone who is practicing the inner sciences in a khanaqah and does not know their limits, they become cult leaders. And if I may say, we've got many people who call themselves sheikhs today who are doing exactly that. So the Sharia is basically what keeps everything in orbit. He also demonstrated that, so Sharia and Sufism were two wings, and he talked about mystical sobriety. In other words, even dhikr is silent. The idea is not to get into a hal or into some greater states of consciousness. It's to be grounded, to be able to serve other people, to be mystically enlightened, to have cleaned your nafs and your inner self, but at the same time be sober, right? This sobriety is a very important part of sahab, so versus sukr, right? He also has a very sophisticated system of dhikr and muraqabah, which is actually, in fact, ends up becoming everyone from the Ottoman kings in the 19th century to the Emirat of Kashgaria, which emerges in Xinjiang in the late 19th century. The very kings are actually practicing these meditative techniques. And these are techniques that are grounded, of course, in Quran and Sunnah, which is the benchmark of all practice. He also basically says that the idea is that one should, to experience a unity with the divine, is not a real experience. It's an experience that is it's a subjective experience. The real experience is one where we recognize that we will never understand the nature of the divine, and we are both connected to the divine and also separate from the divine, right? I mean, of course, there are many people here who will be able to, I think, talk about this at length. So the Mujaddidi silsila becomes the most widespread religious network in the Muslim world before the 20th century, producing some of the greatest ulama from Indonesia and the Hijaz to the Ottoman Empire, to Istanbul, Constantinople. Now, the Mujaddidi Sufis appear everywhere, at the helm of social and intellectual movements, and occasionally rebellions. The Imam Shamil rebellion, a very famous one in the Caucasus that held off the Russians for about 25 years in the 19th century. Does everyone know the Imam Shamil rebellion? It's the War of the Imams. This is when the Russians were taking over the Caucasus.
Imam Shamil.
Imam Shamil, bilkul, ha. So So this is, it's called the War of the Imams. There's about a 40-year period in which the Naqshbandi Mujaddidis are waging a resistance battle. They're also doing it in Central Asia, other parts of the world, in Kurdistan against the nascent Turkish state as well. They had established a remarkable form of parallel popular leadership, which actually transcended and outlived all of the ruling elites. They're still the most important network in places like Indonesia, Afghanistan, and Turkey. In fact, much of Erdogan's support base is actually the Mujaddidis. But most of us don't know why. Now, this book, Hidden Caliphate, essentially argues that the Mujaddidis were synthesizers. They brought together places and spaces and ideas which we consider to be unconnected, using the Sharia as a core, fusing Persian, Arabic, and local traditions, linguistic traditions, poetic traditions, mystical virtuosity, popular religious practices, and the world of the urban ulema into a unified yet flexible articulation of Islam. This gave coherence to Muslims from Siberia to Bosnia, all the way to Indonesia. So before we begin, for simplicity's sake, there's some terms which I'm sure everyone here knows. I'll be using them a lot. Of course, Pir or Sheikh refers to the Sufi teacher, the Khalifa, or plural Khalifa, the deputy. The institutions we're referring to are the mosque, the madrasa, the maktab, the maktab madrasa, and the khaniqah, which is also called the dargah, or the Zawiya. There are various terms that are used, which of course is the center for higher Sufi studies. Now, why is this story so important? Because it totally changes the way in which we look at how the Muslim world functioned before modernity, before colonialism. And I'm going to tell you several ways it does this. First, it overturns the decline narrative. The colonial imagination, our colonial keepers, gave us this idea that Islam went into a height and then continuously declined, right? So you have the Abbasid period, and then afterwards there's a continuous decline. And the reason why that this was given to us was because it positioned the British and the Russian and the French imperial period as one where this region went back into an ascent. So it is necessary to have a down period before we had an up period. We were told that before the British came here, the Russians came here, these regions, Peshawar, Kabul, Kandahar, were isolated backwaters, right? This is, if you ask someone today what is Peshawar, they'll say it's a frontier town. Yes. What is Kabul? They love to fight, right? That's all they do. There's nothing intellectual that comes out of this place. Bukhara, we're told that the king used to toss people off of the Kalyan Minar, which is pictured over there. It's the Qara Khanid monument at the bottom. These are the kind of stories we're told. When we turn away from the colonial accounts and the court chronicles towards these Sufi networks, the ulama networks, we see that despite this political breakup, this vast region remains culturally and intellectually integrated. And the Mujaddidis play a critical role in sustaining a zone of intellectual exchange through texts, through education, through pilgrimage, and through universally trusted models of authority. And I'll talk about this later. They were seen as the honest brokers who tied together the tribal, the urban, and the rural spaces, and seemingly unconnected social movements across the continent. Now, number two, this also breaks down the geographic myth of South and Central Asia and Afghanistan as culturally separate entities. Why is this a problem? Because South Asia is a British term. It refers only to those places that came on British India, right? And we consider now that we are part of a cultural entity called South Asia. Somehow Afghanistan is beyond the frontier. What frontier? For 3,000 years, the Khyber Pass has actually been a highway. It has not been a stopping point. Central Asia is actually Russian Turkestan. But how many of our forefathers came from Bukhara, from Khiva, right? Further west. Most of the ulama and Sufi networks that exist in this part of the world have some connection to Ghazni, to Herat, to Kabul. So this is a way of actually separating identity, when you sort of break off a region and pretend that each one has a cultural identity of its own. This is divide and rule. This is the very basis of divide and rule. Now, the third story I tell is a very different story of Afghanistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa from what we are used to. Remarkably, the Afghan Empire, in our history books today, what is the Durrani Empire? Ahmad Shah Abdali comes in and he destroys a few things and he heads back. We're told it's an outside empire. It was based in Lahore and Peshawar. It's actually, all of Kalat, all of Sindh was part of the empire. So why is it not one's own heritage, right? And the reason for that has everything to do with British colonialism as well, and a fear of Afghan rule, and the revival of a Mughal state under the auspices of Afghan rulership. So the Afghan Empire was a pivot point of trans-Asiatic networks where a host of knowledge systems, spiritual and scholastic networks, and nationalities blended. This work is therefore essential in not only reframing our understanding of Afghanistan and Pakistan's history. Mazrat, main apni zyada kitab ki tareef kar raha hu. So please, I apologize for that. I will not, I cannot vouch for the author, but I'll talk about the book. So it traces how Afghanistan, Pakistan, and these cities like Kabul, Kandahar transformed also from these cosmopolitan hubs with highly complex religious traditions into the isolated backwaters that they are today. And this was done, I would argue, very deliberately. Now, the third thing that this is actually talking against, the fourth thing here, is it breaks the idea that on one side we've got orthodox ulama, and on the other side we've got these, pardon, I'm using this, we've got these sort of Sufis who are outside of Sharia, they're doing their own thing, right? The idea that there's Sufis versus ulama. Everyone here knows that before the 20th century, you could not be an alim in Bosnia or Istanbul unless you actually had an affiliation with a tariqah, right? Of course, you had your association of the school of jurisprudence and the school of theology that you belonged to, and you also had your mashrab, right? Now, before the 20th century, the Sufis, the teachers of meditation, and the writers of divine love poetry, the ulama, the professors of literature, grammar, rhetoric, like some of us here today, exegesis, astronomy, law, epistemology, philosophy, and what we call the ecstatic mystics were all integrated, inseparable, and overlapping. It was not a world of madrasas here and Sufi centers on the other, and these wandering darvishes on the other side. And this, I'm glad I'm talking to an audience here which actually recognizes this. It's very difficult to talk to audiences who come from a purely Western education system to understand what this world is that was left behind. The Mujaddidis and their contemporaries integrated all of these, which made them such potent agents of revival and connectivity. Every alim had to be a Sufi practitioner. Sufis had to abide by Sharia. Finally, and most importantly, this book offers a new understanding of sovereignty in the Muslim world, which, Professor, you did a much better job than me of explaining, of the practical relationship between the state, the subjects, and the religious space of mystics and scholars. I argue here, and I don't have to argue because all of us here have read Shah Waliullah Dahlawi. So there's no argument here. I'm speaking to an audience that knows what I'm talking about. In fact, it's so simple for people who've grown up in this that we wonder why other people don't recognize this. There's a two-tiered paradigm, the way this world worked, the Zahiri and the Batini Caliphate. Right? So the Sufis and ulama provide a trans-regional balance, right? They're the agents of continuity, they're the agents of connectivity. After Karbala, of course after the Rashidun, the very idea that you had state authority that was purely legitimate, right? Spiritual and political state authority, in everyone's mind, whether they're Sunni or Shia, was more or less pushed aside. We knew that the kings would do what they do, and we tolerate them. That's the Zahiri. Basically, they're collecting taxes, they're building roads, they're keeping law and order. But the ulama, which are the Batini and the Zahiri ulama, are the ones who are providing leadership, and not just leadership from a spiritual and intellectual level, psychological counseling services, mediation, trade, diplomatic services between warring states. They could even raise defensive irregular armies when required. They could theologically challenge potentially dangerous ideologies. And at the same time, the state elites, the kings, the princes, the khans, required this umbrella to sustain an interconnected world order. So the urban dwellers, the city dwellers, the pastoralists, the ones who are engaged in nomadic pastoralism, the agriculturalists, the petty princes, the tribal chiefs, the landed gentry, the vaderas, zamindars, they all relied on this network for stability, for communication, for mediation between competing parties and between the visible and invisible realms, right? Now, this is the main thesis. Now, there's certain things I do in this book that are a bit different. Rather than focusing on one figure and one place to understand these Sufi ulama networks, I chose one single Mujaddidi silsila, one lineage, and physically followed, as in I actually traveled, the careers of members of this lineage across generations, from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and onwards into the steppes. The lineage that I chose was one of a fascinating 18th century scholar, Sufi, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad of Peshawar. Back then, Peshawar was a bustling capital and metropolis of the Afghan Empire, and along with Kabul, it drew, what drew me to Hazrat Fazl Ahmad was that he is completely forgotten today. Hazrat Jio Sahib Peshawari. If you go to Peshawar and you ask someone about Hazrat Ji Peshawari, Hazrat Jio Sahib Peshawari, they'll take you to Shobha Bazaar, to the other Hazrat Ji Peshawari. They will not take you to Yakatut. But if you go to Farghana, to Kokand, and you're walking the streets of Kokand and you say that, is there an awlad, are there awlad of Imam Rabbani here, they will show you the madrasa of his son. Now, as I immersed myself in this story and literally followed his footsteps across the Sindhu and the Amu Darya, it appeared that he was connected to almost every major mystical, intellectual, and political figure and social movement in the Afghan Empire and Central Asia of the 18th and 19th centuries. The greatest Uzbek state builders of Bukhara, the Khans, Shah Murad, Amir Haydar, were not just his disciples, but his khulafa, who were assigned by him to teach meditative practices to their own students. Several Afghan kings were his disciples and relied on him for diplomacy. Very strangely, the notorious English agents William Moorcroft and Alexander Burns relied on his son to get them into Central Asia for the first time, for better or for worse. Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's deputies in Peshawar led the charge against Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli's movement. This is a very interesting moment in the 1820s, and his deputies were successful in actually theologically opposing the Mujahideen movement. It's an extremely fascinating moment that I deal with in one of the chapters of my, they write in response to Taqwitul Iman. Now, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son in Kokand was almost like the patron saint of the Khanate. Another family member was the ambassador to St. Petersburg who met with Tsar Nicholas. Shahabuddin Marjani, the greatest Tatar intellectual, was a deputy of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son in Bukhara. Another son was mobilizing thousands of tribal troops in the decisive battle of Nowshera against the Sikhs. Another disciple was the Akhund of Swat. Akhund Swat? नहीं, Akhund Darweza नहीं. Akhund Darweza नंगरहारी तो पहले के हैं. ये Akhund साहिब ये पीर बाबा के बाद, तो पीर बाबा के बाद ये पीर बाबा हज़रत तिरमिज़ी के बाद फिर ये आखुंद दरवेज़ा का, और फिर ये तो यानी 150 साल पहले जिन्होंने वहाँ एक हुकूमत कायम की थी, जहाँ से वो स्वात का शाही सिलसिला चल रहा है. So the custodians of Mazar-e-Sharif, the sacred epicenter of Central Asia, were also Fazl Ahmad's disciples. One of them wrote his biography. Several of the great sheikhs of Siberia were from this lineage. Sheikhs who had such questions, this is true by the way, there's a text on this, as to whether the evening prayers, the Isha prayers, could actually be missed in the winters because there were only 3 hours of daylight in Siberia. In the end, he determined that no, they couldn't be. There was an interesting debate in Siberia about this. One of the largest madrasas in Xinjiang, the Chong Madrasa, up till the 1970s was part of this lineage via Osh in Kyrgyzstan. And yet, how many of us have heard of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's name? I'm so glad. This is the right audience to talk about this. Now, through this story, it becomes clear that this vast inner Asian world was entirely interconnected. The pastoral nomads of Central Asia, the urban centers, what we call the ungovernable highlands, and the rural breadbaskets, Punjab. So at the time of the fracturing of the great empires of the 18th century and the rise of all of these small states and the Khanates and the Afghan Empire, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad and his contemporaries, hundreds, thousands of them, were a glue that kept this world together. So I hope you understand that the core of what this is doing is we are told that the 18th century, Isavi, is one of decline, right? The Mughals, the Safavids, the Ottomans are in decline. And what this book is showing, amongst others that are coming out, is if we look away from the courts and we go to the intellectual scene, we actually find a picture of connectivity almost like none other before. Partly because the states are no longer as powerful, so the ulama actually are rising. So this book ended up like a transgenerational travelogue of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad and his students, which then mirrored my own voyage, starting from Sirhind in North India, to Peshawar in Pakistan, Kabul, Mazar, Bukhara, Tataristan, and the steppes, Farghana and Xinjiang into China, and Dera Ismail Khan and Ghazni. Of course, I must say the journey has been extraordinary for me. Encountering an array of sources. Now, what are the sources that I'm using here? The built environment, histories, biographies, cosmological texts, Tawiz texts, medical texts, polemics, on and so forth, about 20 different genres here, and determining how to approach each of these as historical sources. Because one of the issues that we're facing is we rely too much on the Tazkireh, right, on the Tazkirah. And the Tazkirah is a brilliant, beautiful text, but it is a particular genre with its own limitations. But we have about 20 to 30 different genres that we can work with, and we need to start understanding how to actually use each of these genres, like a waqfnama, how to use it as a historical source, or poetry. Now, one of the great things about this, for me personally, about writing this, was that each of the regions that I worked in had very different sources that were available. So Zakordi and Dera Ismail Khan had certain kind of texts. Bukhara had others. And why this worked in my favor is because each gave a very different angle into how this network actually functioned. The different genres of texts actually give us a very different approach. There are things missing from one type of book that may be extant in another. Dr. Saab, मैं आपसे जिक्र कर रहा था, just recently I was working in Tharparkar at this Waleed madrasa, and I was Deobandi madrasa there, very good friends of mine who have graduated and teaching there. And we were talking about the history of Waleed. And what was remarkable is that we're talking about the fact that it connects to the Makhdoom Hashim Tatwi's silsila in the 18th century, and that this is, by the time of the late 18th century, it's founded, and it's this great madrasa, etc., etc., etc. After a while, when I was discussing with several people, and I asked them how big was the madrasa, how many students, it turns out that for the first 100 years of the madrasa's existence, it was a nomadic madrasa. There was no building. This is often what madrasas looked like in the Kazakh steppes. Now imagine how different it is, a madrasa with a building and curriculum like Deoband, which is in many ways has a kind of modern 19th century structure to it, and sort of breaking our understanding of what a madrasa looks like and thinking about a madrasa that had no physical space. This totally changes the way that we write history, right? So these are the kind of things that the Tazkireh and, let's say, a history of the madrasa itself may not actually tell you. Now, with that very, very long introduction, I hope I'm not boring everyone here.
No.
Okay. Thank you, I appreciate that. I'll take that as a compliment, whether it's intended or not.
You are our guest.
Acha. So with that, I'll begin the remarkable story of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad Peshawari. Now remember, the key take-homes of this are connectivity amidst political fracturing. That fracturing does not mean decline. incredible intellectual exchange and insights into the rich, multifaceted world of the 18th and 19th century scholar. I'm going to give you a lot of details, but I'm doing this to give us a very intimate sense of how this network functioned. Now, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad Peshawari, born in 1743 into Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's brother's family, was a byproduct of the intellectually and spiritually active world of late Mughal Sirhind. It was a cosmopolitan town on the Lahore-Delhi highway, and it hosted, of course, the shrine of Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi and an academic complex which for several generations was the focal point of scholars who produced a large body of literature which synthesized multiple knowledge systems, whether meditation and breathing practices, ilm al-lataif, fiqh, hadith, tafsir. For 24 years, until 1767, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad studied the revealed and rational sciences, and he received intense training in Sufi practices. He attained, of course, ijazas, there are several ijazat name, and he taught for several years at the Khanaqah at Sirhind. Then, in the wake of invasions and the civil war that rocked North India in the mid-18th century, particularly the Sikh invasions, the Mujaddidi Sufis and their disciples left. Many of them were welcomed in the new Afghan empire, from Kashmir all the way to Kabul and then further on to Bukhara. Hazrat Fazl Ahmad in the late 1760s migrated to Peshawar and established himself at a humble mosque, Kaka Jamadar neighborhood, where we're told he earned a reputation by supplying vast quantities of free bread to people in a time of drought, basic social services. His circle of disciples grew, and he eventually set up another Khanaqah, Yakatut, in a neighborhood which came to be known by his son's name, Fazl-e-Haq. Soon after, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad embarked upon the first of 5 journeys to Bukhara via Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif. This is the journey, establishing communities and disciples en route. In Bukhara, he established a Sufi center. It's a very famous Mira Khan madrasa in Bukhara, where the celebrated state builder of Bukhara, the Shah Murad, and his son and successor, and numerous scholars and nobility became his devoted disciples. Now, contemporary sources tell us that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's disciples numbered in the thousands on both sides of the Amu Darya. He appointed 600 khulafa, and this is not an exaggeration, because through the various sources, I have names of over 120 of them right now. Deputies included some of the leading ulama, the mufassirs, the mystical poets specializing in the Masnavi, to Madzub ecstatic mystics. It was a range of all of these. So this is Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's travel route. And all the regions that are listed here are areas with centers that he set up or appointed khulafa who had their own communities. Often khalifas were appointed to teach at their own places of origin, right? So they would go visit him and then they would be sent back. But several from, let's say, Punjab and the Afghan Empire were appointed in Central Asia's chief cities. This is really remarkable. I'll give you an example. There's one khalifa from Wazirabad in Punjab. By the way, Punjabis were in high demand in Central Asia, Sialkotis especially. And we know this, obviously, right?
What?
Sialkot was, it's one of the greatest, sir, please, if I may. Sialkot is Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's teachers from Sialkot. It's some of the most incredible work in scholarship in the Mughal period is done in Sialkot.
Industrial city now.
Abdul Hakim Sialkoti, of course. Yes. Industrial city now. Yahi baat hai na ki we keep looking at just Allama Iqbal, Lahori, jo kehte hain Iran mein, Allama Iqbal.
And
So,
most recent, Faiz Ahmad Faiz.
Faiz Ahmad Faiz. So the thing is, these great figures, these giants, they didn't come from the desert, right? They came from a society that already had an infrastructure. Shah Abdul Latif Bhitai was not a wandering man. He was connected to Lawari Sharif, to Thatta, to Sirhind, to Kabul. There was a world. I'm not denying their greatness and their genius, but what I am saying is we have a tendency to look at them as singular great men coming out of nowhere. And this is part of what I'm trying to break, that the institutions were very much there. So hear this out, because this Khalifa from Wazirabad, Punjab, who arrives in Samarkand, he is appointed in Samarkand, within a few years, his takhallus, or his laqab, is Lal Beg Samarkandi. And he's known as a Samarkandi scholar. and his grave becomes an important place where people pray Fatiha. His son also becomes a Samarkandi scholar. So the transitions were quick. Of course, Persian has everything to do with this. Everyone spoke Persian and, of course, Arabic, which is the core tongue. So many stories follow this pattern. Now, the principal khanaqahs were in Bukhara, in Peshawar, and in Oxus, which is near Mazar-e-Sharif, near the Afghan-Uzbek border. And these then became sort of hubs for sub-networks. So, for example, his son in Bukhara appointed deputies, khulafa, in Tashkent, Tataristan, and Siberia. And similarly, another disciple who many of us would have heard of, Imam Raza Zakori, he's the Pir of Zakori Sharif, appointed another khalifas across, of course, between Ghazni and Dera Ismail Khan. Now, as an example of how these networks and institutions were constructed, really the nuts and bolts, as we say in English, right? Let's consider the story of Imam Raza Zakori. Now, he belonged to a local, venerated, tribe-based, saintly family who are tied to the Miakhil Afghan tribe of Powindas. Okay, what does this mean? These are essentially sedentary nomadic Afghan tribes, spend a certain amount of time in the grazing grounds, and then they lead the nomadic caravans from basically the Indus, in fact from the Hazara belt, down to Dera Ismail Khan, which is one of the belts in Ghazni, and they go up to Bukhara, where they meet the great caravan, the great nomads who are coming from the Kazakh steppes. So this is an inter-Asian trade network. This is a very different environment from Delhi and Peshawar. Very different. So, for one, while Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's urban disciples were accomplished scholars, some of the great scholars who were drawing from Bukhara, Peshawar, Hazrat Imam Raza grew up a goat herd, and he was illiterate. His world was one of fantastical miracles, interwoven with the perils and the opportunities of the caravan journey and its natural environment. If you look at their tazkiras, they say that lions and wild beasts would come to their gatherings. He actually once risked his life to save a wild dog and her puppies. It's actually a very beautiful story in which he's on a caravan trade and he starts hearing a voice and a dog comes to him. And he follows the dog and he tells his disciples and his friends, this is at nighttime in a caravan route, that if he's not actually, does not come back by morning, pray his janazah. He goes and follows the dog, and it turns out that her puppies are hungry. So he puts his finger in his mouth and he throws up whatever food he has, and then he feeds these dogs. This is the kind of service ethos that we're talking about here, right? Now, when Hazrat Imam Raza became Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's Khalifa, there emerged what we call in corporate lingo a synergy. Hazrat Imam Raza brought to the table the respect of his family among the nomadic tribes. He knew how to speak to them, right? He knew how to speak to them. And their sacred spaces along the caravan routes. While Hazrat Fazl Ahmad offered what we may call institutional capacity and links to all of the trans-Asiatic Sufi and madrasa networks and their textual traditions. Within one generation, we find Hazrat Imam Raza's sons composing sophisticated theological and juristic tracts, which cite over 100 works, which were housed at their center in Zakori, in this little village on the nomadic trade routes. So these are the institutions where the urban domain met the pastoral nomadic. Now, several of the Khalifas belong to other Mujaddidi lineages, which reinforce the bonds between different branches of the silsila. These included, for example, the family of the Hazrat-e-Shor Bazar. It's the most influential family in Afghanistan up to date. A Sufi lineage that's left its mark in Afghanistan's history from the late 18th century to the Afghan Jihad and till today. Other Khalifas belong to other established Sufi lineages, whether in Central Asia or the Mughal Empire. So his principal biography is written by his Khalifa at Mazar-e-Sharif, who is in fact the brother of the Mutawalli. In fact, this is Ishan Atiq ko tab jante honge. He's the descendant of and was responsible for Mazar-e-Sharif. So for those who may not know, this is where Sayyidina Ali is believed to be buried. And alongside, of course, Najaf. And the custodians were the de facto governors of the most important shrine state and sacred nucleus of Central Asia. I should mention that Mazar-e-Sharif at this stage had its own military force as well, and the time of breakup. Now, as a prelude to discussing Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's... نه خیلی خیلی اشکال نداره. Now, as a prelude to discussing Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's career in Peshawar and Bukhara, I want to provide a glimpse into a vast topic. His teachings, which follow Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, I apologize, it's very small, so I'll try to guide you through this. They stress the interdependence of tasawwuf and sharia, the batini and the zahiri, as a means to attain spiritual growth and live, of course, according to the sunnah, which is the core of the path. Now, his disciples have left us with a very detailed account of his day. He slept about 4 hours a day. He led a very disciplined life, ascetic and practical, teaching meditation, the revealed and rational sciences, pursuing his own practices, and then managing the day-to-day affairs of the community. Keep in mind the community included the kings of the age. This is quite remarkable. So for example, you'll see here he taught hadith and Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's works, and there are various moments where he does different forms of muraqabah and dhikr. Now, it's important to note that his most reproduced work is just a 10-page handbook. And this is a teacher's manual, and there's a whole chapter in my book dedicated to how this was reproduced and used. So I found about 20 copies of this from Kokand all the way down to Delhi, and seeing who produced it, how it was produced, how it was replicated, what it was replicated with. It's a teacher's manual, and it summarizes some key points on Sufi practice. What's remarkable is the practical way in which he presents Batini knowledge to explain to students what they should expect on the path and the core practices of the curriculum. For example, how to take initiation, the ilm al-lataif, and a comparative analysis of meditative practices and breath within 3 Sufi orders. It's a fascinating text because it gives us the sense of the degree to which spiritual practices had become an empirical science. And they're laid out so systematically that he actually provides pointers to teachers that if at a certain stage the student is not achieving this or is going into this difficulty, this is the way you can address it. So in summary, the teachings which he and other mujaddidis carry from South to Central Asia reflect a philosophy in which breathing techniques, what we may today call sort of advanced psychology and meditation, there's no word for it even today, frankly. We've forgotten that this existed. This existed hand in hand with fiqh and scriptural study. Now, let's turn to Peshawar to explore how its distinctive position during the rise of the Durrani Empire, about 1750 to 1800, allowed it to host an academic infrastructure where ideas could develop and then travel onwards to China, Central Asia, Russia. Now, since Peshawar was one of the most important Mughal cities, we tend to forget this, and trading towns, the Mujaddidi order actually came very soon after it was established in the early 1600s in Sirhind. So by the 1640s, it was already in Peshawar. Particularly when the Duranis came in at the 1750s, the Peshawar Valley greatly benefited because so many ulama came from North India and then settled in the city and around. Then when it, in the 1770s, became one of the dual Afghan capitals. So Kabul and Peshawar were the dual capitals after Kandahar. These sister cities profited from a rejuvenated north-south trade, and land grants to Sufis and ulama increased considerably. There's a friend of mine who's actually written a book based on the horse trade of Central Asia, arguing that the trade that was going through Peshawar, the overland trade, was about several times greater than the sea trade. This is the 18th century. In fact, we're talking about almost 10 times greater than the sea trade. And we tend to forget that horses are the core commodity, right? They're the cars of the age. They're being shipped over from the Kazakh steppes down into southern Asia, and Peshawar has always been the key entrepot of one of the most important trades in this entire region. The result was a closely knit web of Sufi silsilas whose disciples set up madrasas and khanaqahs providing education and social services, where a range of philosophies and teachings coalesced, ready for onward travel to Central Asia, to the open markets of Central Asia. Now, I made this, it's a small representative cross-section of some of the key lineages in Peshawar at the time. The actual map is much bigger, but all of you, of course, since you are scholars, will recognize many of the names here. They're very familiar activists, mystics, anti-colonial revolutionaries, and activists. Kota Mullah is there, Akhund of Swat is there, Hafiz Daraz Peshawari, who is one of the most important, in fact, one of the most important madrasas of Inner Asia. For those who are interested in Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli's movement, Tariqa Muhammadiyah, for me it's a fascinating movement in so many ways. Two of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's key disciples at Peshawar were the most famous scholars there, Hafiz Daraz and Hafiz Azim. Mm-hmm. And in the 1820s, when Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli occupied Peshawar, and he arrived in Peshawar, and then for a year occupied it, they wrote a series of scathing critiques of the movement. So there's a whole sequence of texts where they critique the validity of the movement within the Hanafi tradition. And they successfully transformed, actually, they successfully waged a campaign against them, which is part of the reason why they didn't last. It's a very interesting moment and much more complicated than the way in which we paint it. Now, the Mujaddidi Sufis also played critical roles in providing coherence to a region where governance was decentralized, right? So all of these were petty states. And a well-known adventurer and archaeologist, Charles Mason, thank you so much. He mentions in his notes that certain caravans through the Khyber Pass would be accompanied by Sufis who were recognized by all the tribal authorities. They knew how to negotiate because they were literally like the ambassadors of the region. Everyone acknowledged their authority. They even knew what prices to pay, what taxes were required along the way. In fact, he points out that there are certain routes that could only be traversed by Sufi sheikhs. So Hazrat Fazl Ahmad managed a vigorous trade network. Again, trade was not different from the ulama. Obviously, you need an infrastructure, an economic infrastructure to back up these institutions. Elites from Peshawar to Bukhara gave him mills, land. Oh, I see, acha. Okay. There is, how many more minutes would you like me to conclude in?
What?
Can I give you 5 minutes perhaps?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm going to skip ahead here quite a bit.
Unfortunately.
No, absolutely. I'm going to skip ahead to Bukhara, which actually, like Peshawar, offered ample opportunities for scholars and Sufis under the patronage of the Uzbek Khans. Now, the case study of Bukhara is quite unbelievable because here we find kings who are not just supporters of the Sufis, but they actually trained to become Sufi guides. So when Hazrat Fazl Ahmad arrived in Bukhara, the state started giving stipends for its own scholars to travel to Peshawar and Kabul to study. And then they came back and you had a very sort of similar network of ulama and Sufis developing in Bukhara. Now, it's in this environment in 1770s that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad arrives, and he was given one of the most important madrasas to manage in Bukhara, which is called the Mira Khan. And it's here that he met the young King Shah Murad. Now, even before meeting Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, Shah Murad expressed a deep commitment to Sufism and scholarship. He kept only the company of ulama and Sufis. He abandoned the trappings of royalty and even engaged in manual labor. He even refused to accept kingship until he was pressured by the community to do so. So in 1787, 2 years after he became king, he became initiated into the Mujaddidi path. He would attend Hazrat Fazl Ahmad sessions every morning and evening, spending several hours at the Khanaqah. Eventually, he was so good, they say his tawajjuh was incredible, that he was appointed amongst the Khulafa with permission to guide students on the path, he and his son. And I found 130 letters in St. Petersburg between the Sufi sheikh and the king, which give you an intimate sense of what this relationship looked like. It's under the influence of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad that a new ethos of governance emerged in Bukhara. At a personal level, Shah Murad, the king, reserved only 4 dirhams a day for his own expenses while writing treatises on tafsir. He initiated judicial, fiscal, and legal reforms to reduce tax burdens and curb corruption. Perhaps most significant, he patronized education so much that by the end of his reign, Bukhara was once again revived as a seat of learning by his 80 madrasas by the early 19th century, 30,000 students supported by the state. A new model of kingship appeared in Bukhara, synthesizing Mongol and Persian models within a Mujaddidi ethical consciousness. Entries on Shah Murad in the chronicles begin with the hadith of Tajdeed. Shah Murad is especially called the Mujaddid of the century. He assumes the throne at 1200 Hijri and revives the Sunnah. The ideal king is still the Perso-Turkic empire builder, the administrator, and the soldier, but to this is added the humble ascetic scholar, the accessible supporter of the masses, and the patron of the khanaqahs and madrasas. Now finally, I will end here with saying that with patronage from both sides of the Oxus and Indus, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's order spread rapidly across Asia. His last trip to Bukhara was 1814. 2 years later, he passed away in 1816. The Indian traveler and diplomat Mohan Lal Kashmiri calls his son in Peshawar the saint of all Peshawar and Turkestan. His son and successor in Bukhara, in fact, his grandson was the imam of the Pesh Imam of the Jami Masjid. He was the teacher of the Tatar scholar Marjani. Half of Bukhara came to his funeral. Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son in Kokand, and this is the institution in Farghana, was actually the teacher of the greatest poet of the Uzbek language, Muqimi, of the 19th century. One of the greatest madrasas in China, as I said, comes from this lineage. And surprisingly, the last of his great descendants in the late 20th century was the arch saint of North Waziristan and the spiritual guide of, in fact, the tribal belt throughout all of the wars. He ran a publishing house with books on philosophy, meditation, poetry, various religious sciences in 4 languages. Now, I'm going to finally, just give me 1 minute, talk about this shajra, which is in Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's mazar in Peshawar. And in this shajra, it comes from Prophet, peace be upon him, to Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi. And what's remarkable is you'll see all of these great khanaqahs here. You'll see the Khanaqah Mazariya in Delhi, where Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan spent his youth. You'll find the Khanaqah Shor Bazar, etc., etc. What's fascinating about this is this contains all the greatest sort of ulama lineages of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Central Asia is not here. So in other words, the links were severed. And how the links were severed and why they were severed is actually the subject of a part of this book. Thank you very much.